Hey everyone, tonight we'll start with the extraordinary lives and astounding fortitude of medieval peasants. Common people who overcame great adversity to survive some of the coldest and bloodiest nights in history from. Their tale is one of communal sleeping techniques and homemade insulating tactics, of perseverance, resourcefulness, and resolve. So before you settle in, please take a moment to subscribe and like the video, but only if you truly like what I. Tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you in the comments section. It's amazing to see who is coming from all around the world. Now turn off the lights and perhaps turn on a admirer of that gentle background hum, and let's take it slow tonight while we explore medieval life. For the typical peasant, winter was less about lavish feasts and joyous festivals than you might think for jousting knights. It wasn't just a season, it was a celebration of life, and more about how we might avoid dying tonight. An annual endurance test that was particularly harsh and didn't believe in second chances. Imagine for a moment that you live in a small stick-and-mud home with walls so narrow, with no insulation, you might likely hear a bird sneeze from outside. Windows, unless you include a tiny opening filled with animal hide, and most surely, your home's interior temperature was typically only a courteous couple of degrees, so there were no thermostat conflicts with your siblings. Regardless of what the weather was doing outside, it was courteously a little less freezing if it was freezing. The toughest nights were inside, when the blackness engulfed everything and the wind howled like a vengeful ghost, while the hearth fire pitifully flickered, trying its hardest but mostly merely frying the toes of the person seated closest to you. If you were across the room, you might as well have been. It didn't help much either to camp outside with worse food and clothes. Peasants wore a few rough-spun wool tunics, and sometimes a cloak instead of expensive fur coats or goose-down blankets. It had a weird goat scent, and you hoped that putting them on top would make you resemble a human onion. Didn't work at all, and forget about cuddling up in cozy comforters. Frequently just sacks filled with straw or hay, possibly with a few old rushes added for good measure, and the term medieval peasant life refers to the extra luxury that some fleas provide for the company. In addition to being uncomfortable, the cold posed a risk of frostbite, hypothermia, and there was always a chance of general freezing to death, particularly for young children, and the being alive when you woke up each morning as an elderly person was regarded as a small marvel that was very worth. Surviving a medieval winter, perhaps with a somewhat less frozen turnip for breakfast, wasn't about comfort, but rather about clenching your teeth and applying pressure to every huddled with your livestock, a piece of cloth you had, hoping you didn't wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows. And the true journey was only getting started if you believe because the window doesn't close all the way, the apartment is drafty. Medieval peasants would like to say that their homes weren't. The majority of peasant cottages were what historians described as simply drafty. They were essentially very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Call lee and dorb construction with courtesy. Translation: sticks. Crosswise like a huge basket covered with a lovely concoction of dirt, straw, and animal feces was a cheap, sticky substance. And no, they weren't attempting to be disgusting. Insulator, and it was always accessible, so let's pretend that these barriers don't. The chilly wind found every crevice, so no matter how carefully smeared, it had little chance against a real winter storm. Every opening and joyfully swooped into the one-room houses, circling and ensuring you never got to cozy seclusion that isn't really warm or character-building. Indeed, and then there were the thatched roofs, which were quite charming. However, over several months of rain and snow, they began to sag, leak, and occasionally allow the local fauna to enter. Nice evening, like if a squirrel had fallen on your dining windows, which, if they existed at all, were ridiculously little. Although typically covered with wooden shutters or thin animal hides, the glass was so costly that even the lord of the manor most likely couldn't afford more than one little inconvenience, and peasants were only pleased if the cowhide wasn't torn from the wall in the middle of a blizzard to exacerbate the situation on the flooring, were frequently simply compacted soil, and when it rained or snowed a lot, mud would seep up into the earth. Thus, in a sense, they had indoor water features, though they didn't particularly value them during the winter. It could feel like you're walking across a frozen swamp every time you enter your own house. It was three-dimensional, chilly from below, cold from above, and cold from within. Heat attack, but medieval peasants weren't the kind to complain. Human insulation was cuddled close to one another, moss-packed holes, and old rags pushed into the worst drafts. Greatest ingenuity, obstinacy, and a little sheep grease applied to the walls were frequently the only thing preventing them from turning into medieval popsicles, because if your home was collapsing, mud and goat hair provided the best defense against the weather. At least if your teeth weren't chattering, you could sort of chuckle about it. As if the bitter cold wasn't difficult enough, medieval peasants also had to contend with a silent foe that rose from below. Back then, the frozen ground's floors weren't actually floors. Rather, they were only marginally flatter. Areas of dirt within your house. Perhaps, if you were fortunate, someone had tossed some old rushes or straw to give. You gave off the appearance of being comfortable, but in reality, you were sleeping when someone criticized you. The cold was unrelenting and seeped up as you backed away from the hard, icy soil, emerging from the ground like a malevolent tiny ghost that worms its way through the straw, into your bones, and directly into your... Hey, congrats. If you dropped something on the ground during a wintry night, it became a part of the... Permafrost medieval peasants attempted to combat this bleak conflict in a number of methods, including, if you could afford it, the technique involved spreading thick mats of straw across the floor. Or, more practically, you could have a chance if you could take enough of it from your neighbor's field without being discovered. Good insulating barrier. However, the straw quickly became flattened and moldy. Some households stacked dried rushes, adding a crunchy soundtrack to your already dreary nights. Instead, they would occasionally toss new rushes on top of the dirt without clearing away the previous ones. This eventually produced an intriguing ecosystem of fleas and decaying plants. And whatever enigmatic animals chose to settle there, it was essentially medieval. If your carpet smelled like a wet dog and was a little damp, consider installing carpet padding. For those who owned them, beds typically accomplished nothing more than, instead of being cozy, wooden frames filled with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Your mattresses shifting, gritty layers did little to stop the cold from emanating from below. And turning was a desperate, awkward ballet to keep the blood flowing and prevent one side of the body from freezing, not for comfort. The truth is that medieval peasants did not so much conquer the ice terrain as a good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. Rather, it was about waking up with the ability to live contentedly above it. You were doing well if you could take that off with all of your toes still attached. Superior to most if medieval houses had a winter hero, it wasn't the walls, the roof, or even the courageous. A stubborn fire was burning in the fireplace, insulated by layers of dirt and manure. Pit that provided the only practical protection from the medieval cold, darkness, and general gloom. A basic fire was the focal point of almost every peasant dwelling. Fireplace with an ornate stone mantel, but instead of a tidy chimney that blew smoke into the air, you had a simple pit or rock pile, partially burned wood, and enough smoke filling the space to make you question whether you were slowly turning into a ham. Yes, the majority of homes didn't even have. Smoke from chimneys simply did its best to float out via tiny gaps in. It wasn't ideal for the roof to crack in the walls or to go straight into your lungs if it was feeling lazy that night, breathing or your life expectancy. But on the plus side, it performed a fantastic job of when fumigating fleas and other undesirable visitors who require pest control. You're marinating in smoke 247. The kitchen's light was just as important as the hearth's warmth. People would sit around the fire and tell stories, and occasionally they would even use the medieval equivalent of a television. Since there wasn't much else to do after dark to keep the fire going, people would either gossip or just stare into the flames. Alive wasn't merely a good idea. It was necessary to allow the fire to extinguish at. Night was like sending a signal for the cold to come in and kill you, and it wasn't as easy to start a fire in the winter. It was as simple as striking a match, but you needed more prayers than you'd imagine, flint steel kindling, and, already provided, each member of the household had a responsibility to feed the fire while keeping an eye on the embers. It was a great way to add peat sticks, or if you were lucky, a valuable piece of dried wood. Ongoing conflict between human tenacity and the oppressive cold that only wants to drown you. Although survival without the hearth was not guaranteed, it was definitely impossible. It was a small, smoky fire that frequently disappointed, but if there was one thing about medieval winter, it was the pulsating core of hope. Peasants were more afraid of letting the fire go out overnight without that comforting flickering than they were of running out of ale. Thus, the cold would infiltrate more quickly than a tax collector following harvest. Additionally, building a fire from scratch in the midst of winter wasn't only inconvenient, it might be fatal. Lighters dream of rekindling a fire, although they didn't exist yet, meant asking for a single precious spark by hitting flint and steel together, then tenderly caring for that spark. Imagine love and any dry kindling you haven't already burned in the previous days. Attempting to complete all of this while half asleep and with icy fingers in the dark. For further inspiration, include a wolf roaring in the distance, so the peasants became clever and, not in a comfortable savings account, but rather by carefully burying. Before going to bed, the embers were beneath a pile of ash, which served as a blanket, protecting the blazing coals and ensuring their survival till the next day if you could walk over before dawn, poke a little at the pile, add some fresh wood, and have a fire without the. However, if you did it poorly, let's just say that mornings got a lot of. Fire banking, a much grumpier and colder technique, was inherited from. Like a treasured family recipe, parent to kid, everyone had their own little secrets. Some said to use only dry ash. Some said that a small amount of moisture was essential, while others packed the embers tightly. Allow them to breathe. By offering a superior fire banking technique, you may essentially create a medieval dispute. It was the archaic equivalent of debating barbecue methods, but with marginally more implications for survival. A howling wind may occasionally burrow through a crevice and put out the fire even if banking it wasn't enough, or some families took turns getting up in the morning, since it was possible for clumsy sheep to fall into the hearth. In the end, fire banking is the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat at night to check the coals. It was more about purchasing a few more valuable hours of warmth than it was about conquering nature, and if you woke up to even one remaining ember, which was your triumph in that moment and sufficient to withstand another day of fighting the cold in the Middle Ages, the saying, "the more the merrier," was a winter survival strategy that went beyond parties when there was only one reliable source of warmth, each other, as the fire flickered and the frigid winds whistled through every crevice. And if it meant sharing a bed with your whole family, your neighbor's animals, and perhaps a very perplexed private space wasn't even an idea on Goose, so forget about it. Comfort wasn't the aim on the coldest nights. Rather, it was to avoid waking up frozen. Whole households were heaped onto the floor and covered in the warmest corner of the house. They created what could be best characterized as a desperate snoring person out of whatever shreds of cloth they could locate. Lasagna with younger children crammed between parents and grandparents cuddling beneath the outer layers, and there was always space if Cousin Ethel appeared out of the blue. Additionally, if you were fortunate, you were able to sleep in the center, where body heat emanated from every direction. Unfortunately, you were perched on the brink, which is the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to a meat locker door. Someone who moved excessively during the night, shifting once to settle in, and then knocking on Aunt Maud's door. Congratulations, you're now a member of the family, as you enter the icy draft by the wall. There were occasions when the villain even shared bedding, a straw mattress that gradually deteriorated beneath the overnight weight of several generations, and the fact that, at the time, hygiene wasn't exactly garnering any accolades. To put it mildly, it wasn't the most odorous sleeping setup, but when you're up against frostbite, you stop. According to some medieval guides, being choosy about body heat wasn't simply pleasant, it was strategic. Also suggested purposefully placing the group's warmest and strongest members outside like human shields. Frail elderly people and infants were buried deep in the center, receiving treatment against the cold. Although it eventually became a part of their life, this wasn't only for survival, like the priceless tiny heat generators they were. Long winter evenings spent huddled together as a family was a part of everyday life and led to singing, storytelling, and definitely some really fascinating discussions that were muffled by a communal wool blanket. So, remember that at least you're not fighting the next time your dog hogs the bed or your sibling snatches your blanket for elbow room between a very critical goat and a snoring uncle. If you felt that contemporary roommates were difficult, medieval peasants would like to show you their winter. Housemates, pigs, chickens, goats, cows, and pretty much everything with a heartbeat and a. Bringing animals within with a little body heat wasn't just a peculiar hamlet custom. It was essential for. In a poorly insulated vale where the wind howled louder than your stomach, survival livestock provided warmth. Every inch counted, and if you're goat and you were on the same wall, it was. Two birds are somewhat less likely to be stolen in the middle of the night by a neighbor. The house turned into a chaotic living furnace of chickens at night because of one odorous stone. Cows lounged in luxury while pigs snorted next to the fireplace, nestled in corners. It wasn't fancy at all, munching cud against the walls as if they were paying rent. Imagine being stranded in a car during a summer road trip with someone who neglected to take a shower. That's a cow, though, and it's winter, and there's nowhere else to go. The fragrance of a shared winter was something that was legendary by springtime. Furious, your nose were already experiencing a crazy journey before you ever lit a lamp. Yet medieval peasants created a. They didn't moan much since they were aware of the unsettling fact that the more creatures inside, the fewer. Some animals even had good places, such as cows, despite having cold toes in the morning. Near the family goats, the largest and warmest goats typically took the stage, let closer in for their warmth, and since goats would inevitably find a way inside, hens roost inside. Rafters or old baskets and pigs. Well, the pigs just plopped down, not caring. Anywhere they wanted, most likely in the center of the floor, of course, sharing your bedroom with animals. Wasn't risk-free. Picture falling asleep quietly just to be abruptly. A bird stumbling barefoot into something or determining your hair makes an excellent perch can wake you up. The first thing in the morning could be suspicious. Certainly, medieval mornings could be full of. Peasants grasped the basic math despite the cacophony, odors, and odd hoof to the ribs. In the fight against the frigid winter, cows cuddle whether they want to or not, and cold kills. In the Middle Ages, a warm, slightly slobbery cow's breath was frequently the difference between life and death. The goal of winter fashion was to keep peasants alive, not to look attractive. Weren't browsing the newest styles. Instead, they were dressing as though they were getting ready to fight The Grim Reaper himself had a simple rule. If you owned it, you wore it occasionally. First, the simple undertunic is made of scratchy, possibly unclean linen. Over that, place a heavier woolen tunic, and if you have it, add additional. A ragged cloak hung over your shoulders, trousers that sagged at the knees, and if you were extremely fortunate, a patched. Congratulations. A sheep's skin is put on top like a trophy. 90% itchier boots and 10% warmer boots were a. Affluence. Many peasants placed their feet inside wooden clogs and covered them with layers of fabric or old rags. The cold continued to bite, so you simply put another rag, and I hoped you avoided losing your foot and forgetting to wash all these layers. It was necessary to pull your clothing to a frozen creek in the middle of winter and then smash through the ice. If your one and only shirt didn't freeze into a terrible shirt, you would have to wait 2 days for it to dry. Thus, the majority of peasants prudently concluded that smelling like a mixture of smoke, perspiration, and sheep were a minor cost of not freezing solid, and the grime and oil were particularly intriguing. An added benefit of accumulation was that the dirty layer that was trapped inside the body provided insulation, like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, but it was much less socially acceptable and smelled worse than the caps, scarves, and gloves of today. Were cherished items. A basic woolen cap may determine whether they survived the night or woke up. Gloves were frequently constructed from whatever was available, including hair frozen to the wall. People could scrangle leather or cloth shreds, sometimes appearing more depressed. Puppet costumes over anything trendy, and kids were particularly swaddled until they looked more like. The objective was to catch the filled turnips as they waddled clumsily around the house. Style, elegance, and as much precious body heat as possible. I've never heard of them. The true medieval flex was warmth, so the next time you gripe about wearing layers, remember this. On a cold day, keep in mind that medieval peasants would go around in half of their clothes at once, looking like. In the dirt of the medieval peasant playbook, lumpy laundry sacks and feeling fortunate for it weren't merely something you cleaned off was really a survival tool because, as it turns out, becoming dirty wasn't an indication that you'd. It was tactical and smart, dare we say, to give up on life. Genius saw that winter presented a unique challenge: heat loss from clean garments. Even though newly laundered linen was breathable, it was shockingly bad at keeping you warm. However, when the temperature of the air was somewhere between that of hypothermia and immediate regret, so it wasn't particularly appealing. Point, where dirt entered the picture as peasants labored day after day. Layers of dirt, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud started to accumulate after a day without cleaning their clothes. Over time, this natural armor filled the tiny holes in their leggings, cloaks, and tunics. It was like the Middle Ages, with holes in the fabric making clothing more windproof. Simply put, weatherproofing made you smell more like a goat. You lost a wager, yet you were actually warm. Some medieval people felt that bathing yourself too frequently during the winter could really make you ill, so it's best to maintain that protective barrier intact. When it did exist, soap was rare, laundry was very rarer, and bathing with the filth barrier intact was saved for important events, such as when the bishop arrived, or even just before you passed away. To add to the plan, peasants layered their garments, simply tossing the fresh layer on top of the previous one without altering the ones underneath. You ultimately turned into a walking museum of all the stains from the previous 6 weeks, narrating the valiant tale of how I once slipped in the mud and survived. Medieval peasants may have appeared and smelled like they to outside onlookers, had entirely abandoned personal cleanliness, but the peasants were aware that filthy. The crusty tunic served as a heat barrier to prevent frostbite death, but it wasn't dazzling but not so cold that you didn't want to smell like flowers, except from in a world where you weren't hurting anyone's nose, but absolutely everyone stank to heaven. Yes, during the medieval winters, grime wasn't a problem because blindness was essentially a way of life. Failure, it was both functional and fashionable, and if you had a thick, oily exterior. By February, my buddy, you were succeeding in life if you believed in the Middle Ages. Peasants huddled together in embroidered quilts and luxurious feather mattresses throughout the winter, but the truth was a little different. More rustic. By rustic, I mean let's hope and sleep on a heap of dead plants. Because the best beds were typically rough in the medieval peasant life. If you could afford it, a timber frame covered with a large sack filled with old rushes or straw hay would be ideal. No orthopedic support, memory foam, or five-star hotel. Encounter just a slightly prickly, gritty, lumpy stuff that had a subtle scent of. Every twist and turn of the night provided a lovely soundtrack of barnyard and remorse. Some peasants are stalked by crinkling straw and the occasional harsh punch from a rogue. Even omitted the wooden frame completely, throwing the straw directly onto the dirt floor to create an opulent sleeping experience that contemporary influencers would most likely rename as The straw beds in earth-connected sleep were not only uncomfortable, but they were also only transitory. Over time, the straw changed the straw because it had become a biological danger area, flattened, grew moldy, attracted pests, and generally, often carried out a few times a year if you were conscientious, or whenever your bed began to move aggressively without your permission. Rushes were a common substitute for these long grasses, which were occasionally thickly distributed on the ground, combined with herbs like lavender or rosemary to cover up the overpowering smell of new livestock in daily living. For around a day, rushes had a pleasant scent before becoming a part of the muck. Inside the house, the trodden landscape blends in perfectly with the dirt, meals, crumbs, anything else that happened to walk in, and of course, the bedfellow's fleas. If you woke up scratching, it was because lice and other cute creatures enjoyed straw bedding nearly as much as the peasants did. More than you slept, congrats. You were experiencing the real medieval world. Despite the difficulties, these modest beds saved lives. Straw mounds clumped together on top of them and offered a vital insulating barrier against the freezing ground. Medieval central heating at its best, creating pockets of shared body heat, so that the next time you gentle, supportive mattress, just think of a medieval peasant someplace, is observing you from the past, smiling through a gaping mouth and stating, "Must be nice." You soon discover that winter breezes are more than just an annoyance when you dwell in a house built of sticks, mud, and hope. Medieval peasants did not merely combat the cold from the outside. They also engaged in personal attacks. Believe me when I say that they battled it from within their own homes, using just whatever they could jam into the crevices. The walls were cracked, the mud was bent, the thatch was collapsed, and the cold sagged. Seems to sneak into new locations every night like a cunning poltergeist with a. Peasants filled in the cracks with moss, turning grudge sealing the home into an art form. Bundles of dried grass, straw remnants, old fabric, and occasionally even animal hair if it was wedged into a hole and felt soft, spongy, or somewhat insulating. Some more tenacious individuals spread additional mud and manure layers over the exterior of their walls as a yearly winter undertaking. Picture yourself standing therein, slapping cold manure onto your own home in freezing weather and murmuring, "This is okay, this is luxury," since, in a sense, roof leaks constituted yet another battleground. Despite being inexpensive and widely available, thatch wasn't particularly waterproof, especially after during a few rainy and snowy seasons, peasants would use extra textile scraps, bundles of books, or in times of extreme despair, pieces of turf are taken from the closest field each. At some point, house began to resemble a somewhat depressing patchwork quilt created by someone who gave up in the middle. If you had windows or doors, you were fortunate, but even so, they were little. In addition to iron nails holding wood boards, window apertures were frequently wrapped with thick fabric saturated in animal fat or animal hides to keep out the harshest drafts and provide an added scent of. Bringing mystery meat into the living room each night was a conflict between human resourcefulness and the unrelenting. You might be toasty 1 minute, and then a quick gust of wind would find the. You missed it, yet somehow it slapped you awake like a cold hand of doom. By cunning, obstinacy, and an unwillingness to accept a little bit of frozen, persistent condition of being medieval peasants who endured the harshest winters befuddled, packed, and patched. When the cold hits, nature can present them with one dirty fistful at a time. The medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even bother to act like it's not difficult enough to keep you up at night. Instead of everyone napping at once, they came up with a survival plan that today would be proud of any military leader to sleep throughout shifts. It wasn't some well-planned system with roll calls and whistles was far more basic and needy. While half of the family stayed up to tend to the fire and fix any stray drafts, the other half huddled under, attempting to get a few hours of half-frozen slumber with threadbare blankets and hay. The fire required continuous. If attention was ignored, it would wane, and remembering to renew it was roughly as Someone had to be on Ember Patrol since it was as simple as persuading an obstinate donkey to dance, and nobody wanted to get up. Families switched shifts after they were at last comfortable, and you fell asleep for a few hours. Lurched over to the hearth after being elbowed awake, trying not to poke, prod, and curse the fire back to life. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There were no late-night snacks or night vision goggles. Definitely not 5 more minutes of snooze buttons, just heavy eyes and stiff joints. Having a mounting grudge against the person who slept the loudest during your shift, kids old enough to wield a stick were. Early on in the service learning process, everyone did their share of the work over the winter. Or stopped trying. Grandparents occasionally lingered by the fire for longer because of their experience, and to be honest, because having arthritis made it really difficult to lie down and get back up, especially when it was. Good luck with people moving around, animals rustling, and wind when it's your turn to sleep. Pounding on the walls, and the sporadic poke from a sibling who unintentionally rolled over too forcefully. It was a wonder to obtain good sleep, yet the system functioned in spite of the fatigue. There was always a pair of eyes and icy, reluctant hands available to keep the hearth burning when people slept in shifts. Next time you complain, remember that the family survived because the embers did. Consider the medieval peasant peeking into a window while you're considering getting up to change the thermostat or let the cat out. Considering that it's cold when you have to smoke at 3 in the morning, I questioned whether toes were really that important. Consider how you must breathe to survive. Medieval peasants used more than just cloaks to fight the frigid air. Fires and inventive sleeping configurations. They even modified their breathing patterns to endure the night. The issue was straightforward. Chilly air was drawn directly into the mouth by deep, open breathing. In a world where pneumonia might kill you before you could say, "Hail Mary," which was a danger that no one wanted to take, peasants acquired the skill of what is often referred to as survival breathing in order to. Instead of taking deep breaths, as if they had just finished a marathon, they breathed slowly and shallowly. Most significantly, the goal was to gradually warm the nose. Air entering their lungs a little before it did so. It wasn't flawless, but it was. Better than unintentionally taking a large gulp of frigid air and choking yourself to death by February. Congratulations. You've just purchased a ticket for a week of tearing apart parts of your soul without the assistance of any medical professionals. In sight, and Grandma is giving you strong prayers and hot onion tea. People even created a makeshift breath by sleeping with pieces of their cloaks, shawls, or rags pulled up over their faces. Warmer barrier, which naturally resulted in a patch of damp, slightly soggy fabric sticking to your mouth by. Children were taught these skills early in the morning, but it was still better than freezing from the inside out. During the chilly months, parents would reprimand children for panting like dogs indoors, and to be honest, between strict. Medieval childhood winters were marked by breathing exercises, uncomfortable wool clothing, and sharing a bed with a hostile, gassy goat. At night, snuggled under straw bedding, character development takes on a whole new level. Breathing became an art form next to a softly steaming cow and heaps of cloaks. Construct a nose that is constant and gradual, and as little as possible like some gloomy medieval yoga retreat, but with more frostbite and less. Though it wasn't the most eye-catching tactic, the grand survival playbooks encouraging sayings. Peasants toiled through another night in the fields, one short breath at a time. In the never-ending struggle against the harsh winters of the Middle Ages, peasants found in. One of the finest ways to use an unusual secret weapon is to have a full stomach. Stuffing yourself with something substantial and heavy was a better way to combat the cold than wearing another itchy wool cloak. The more calories your body needed to process before bed, the warmer it would be. As it worked, it heated up more. This is how fundamental medieval thermodynamics works. Heavy meals produce heat internally, and may even help you live until morning. Before a long time, what did medieval peasants heap upon their plates without becoming a peasant-shaped popsicle? Consider making hearty stews with a lot of root vegetables, such as turnips and onions, on chilly nights. Additionally, The parsnip grains, oat porridge, barley grl, or thick chewy, were lifesavers. If you were particularly fortunate, such as following a celebration day or a generous, this wasn't comforting. You might even get a piece of dried sausage or a chunk of salty pork thrown into the stew. Instagram cuisine lacks artistic garnishes and a sophisticated presentation. It was a single, massive, hazily brown meal meant to burn slowly through your stomach like a friendly brick. The evening and keeping you slightly warmer, it wasn't only about consuming much of it concerned consuming intelligent foods that were slower to digest and offered a gradual. Fatty foods were especially commended for their constant drip of warmth, not only for the energy they offered, but a gut full of fat burned more slowly than lean meat. Peak medieval winter luxury consisted of stew bread and a dubious quantity of lard. Even the pickiest kids were fed well by their parents, so it didn't matter if Tiny Thomas didn't enjoy turnips. Consume the bitter but useful turnips, or you shivered through the night thinking about how much you missed them. Naturally, medieval parenting involved a lot of eating at night. Carried risks of its own. Although you might be warmer, you were also running the chance of having a night filled with vivid, strange nightmares that were driven by Was it worth it to strive frantically to digest a field's worth of cabbages? Definitely, since peasants' ultimate goal was to survive rather than to eat a Michelin-starred meal, and if that entailed sleeping with a swollen body and breathing through your nose while near a steaming cow, well, that was only another night in the never-ending pursuit of another icy dawn, long before fancy heated blankets and electric blankets. Mattress pads. If medieval peasants desired a bit more warmth at home, they had to get inventive. Bedtime, making the ever-glitzy hot stone, and the unassuming haybox the unsung heroes of winter. Heroes, let's begin by discussing the haybox. It sounds rustic, and it was. However, the brilliant idea was for peasants to line it with a solid wooden box, firmly with hay, and use it to keep previously prepared meals warm for hours. Remaining stew. Put the hot porridge in the hay box and cover it. It will keep hot enough for a late-night snack without requiring medieval slow cookers essentially, but peasants didn't take the chance of rekindling the fire. Simply stop at food. They discovered that hay could trap heat from something else if it could do the same for a stew pot. Before going to bed, even greater rocks enter the hot stone era. Someone would most likely pick up a flat stone and throw it into the heart of the unfortunate child who lost the family dispute of the fireplace after roasting it until it was almost too hot to touch the delicate boundary between third party and helpful. With the stone still radiating, they would use a stick or some old tongs to fish it out. Joyful warmth would be gently wrapped in rags and stuffed into a clay pot or nestled inside an old piece of linen. Concealed a medieval heating pad at the foot of the bed or beneath the hay in the mattress, prepared to fight. Naturally, there were dangers if you didn't correctly wrap the stone, but congrats. You now have a small, localized house fire. And let's just say that if you dropped it on your foot, claim that slipping on ice wasn't usually the source of winter injuries, but when everything went according to plan, that stone offered hours of priceless, reassuring warmth. It wasn't opulent, but when you lived, luxury in a half-frozen cabin was not having icicles hanging over your head when you woke up. A heated rock from your nose among the vast arsenal of medieval winter survival. Although it may not sound glamorous, snuggling into some hay was a necessity for peasants who were desperate for any heat they could find. Little miracle. The hearth wasn't only used for cooking dinner in a medieval peasant's house. It was essentially a family member, albeit a smoky, temperamental, and occasionally uncooperative one. Still vital for existence, particularly when it came to sleeping. Your chances of waking up unfrozen increased with proximity to the fire. Therefore, sleeping arrangements were less about individual taste and more about placing babies in strategic. Prime real estate parents gave preference to the elderly and those who were ill or fragile. Stronger adults and older children spread out from there like layers of human insulation, each being given a location near. Babies were delicate, And the fire wasn't just an act of goodwill, it was fundamental survival math. Elders and heat generators were invaluable sources of family wisdom, and, let's face it, the best rumors. It wasn't negotiable to keep them warm, yet roasting by the fire too near wasn't comfortable. You ran the chance of waking up with your cloak smoldering suspiciously too far, or your hair singed, and you were. It was a careful dance to be close enough to bask, essentially camping in an icebox. In the glow of the fire, but not close enough that you had to tell your neighbor that you now appeared half-cooked. Additionally, the fire primarily burned the victims rather than distributing warmth evenly. Right in front of it, while everyone else squabbled like icy lizards for a place in the limited cone of heat. If you were fortunate enough to sleep with your back to the fire, you might have one side that is deliciously warm and one side that isn't. Pets and animals, of course, are muscled in too, and a dog might wedge itself because it's frozen so solid you could probably bang on it. Between you and the flaming chickens that are wagging dangerously close to you, occasionally clucking gently into the night while perilously perched on hearthstones, resembling small, feathery protectors of. Every shift of burning embers, every crackle of the logs, and every warmth was a small. Assure me that you are still alive and that you are currently warm, so peasants drifted. The pops and hisses of the fire lulled them into restless sleep as each breath formed. Beyond the brittle circle of the fire, little clouds in the cold air weren't. Although it wasn't cozy, it was ideal. Life was barely hanging on to warmth. In the medieval era, no one survived the winter by themselves unless they so desired thanks to blazing coals. By January, survival had evolved into more than just a family to become a highly fashionable frozen statue. Arrangement, it was a noisy, dirty local project where the peasants understood that everyone's life and comfort depended on one another in. A mound of hay and a powerful fire in the depth of winter could only accomplish so much if. You saw that the smoke from Old Tom's hearth had abruptly stopped curling into the darkness at your neighbor's house. But it wasn't just because Tom owed you a chicken that someone went to inspect the sky. That could be a contributing factor. However, because of the need for collective survival, towns experienced an unofficial winter. Watchers are frequently young or elderly people who are unable to labor in the fields, but can monitor who is coughing excessively, whose house appeared a bit too motionless in the morning frost, or who hadn't visited the market to trade in a few days. With a lot more sheep and no luminous vests, these individuals were the medieval equivalent of neighborhood patrol. In the event that a family's fire went out, a nice neighbor would bring a blazing coal wrapped in rags and dash over, or even better, invite them inside. Yes, that meant cramming an extra room into their own smoke-filled, crammed hut for the night. It was preferable to finding frozen companions come spring Thorug, even though 4 bodies were placed in an already small area. Food reserves also played a part. During particularly harsh winters, towns occasionally withdrew their last salted meat. Grain and dried vegetables were the only things everyone had, but it was a terrible charity. The difference between stumbling into spring or not could be determined by community meals. Even kids were aware of the risks. They assisted in delivering wood, sharing embers, and sent urgent signals to anybody in need of assistance. Nobody was too little or exhausted. Medieval communities weren't all sunshine and hugs when winter arrived. Arguments broke out. Disagreements over who borrowed whose nice cooking where never truly went, or about land goats. Away, but as the evenings turned icy, old grievances were frequently silently shelved since it was still worthwhile to save the arrival because it might. When you needed help in the bitter cold of winter, the entire community turned into one large, uncooperative family. Occasionally dysfunctional, frequently humorous, and always aggressively survival-minded. One frozen smile, one crackling fire, and one muddy boot at a time. Medieval peasants did more than simply fuel the fire or put on cloaks when they confronted the harsh winter cold. When the wind outside your paper howled like wolves, they prayed a lot. You wanted every advantage conceivable, including a little divine intervention, but the fire dwindled to gloomy embers and the walls were thin. Back then, intervention faith was ingrained in every freezer meal and wasn't just a Sunday event. Families would inhale before scuttling beneath layers of straw and scratchy wool. Kneel together, saying quick prayers to protect the ceiling from burning and their toes connected by. The morning saints evolved into more than just far-off religious leaders. They were the frontline defenders of winter. For example, asked to guard against throat conditions, which are serious issues because a single swallow of cold air might land you. Coughing up your soul, St. Nicholas was more than simply the immortal cheerful gift giver. Additionally, he was urged to save homes from unexpected destruction during the lean, fatal months when superstitions were rampant. Some families sprinkled a small amount of holy water close to the hearth before daily survival, asleep in the hopes that it might ward off evil spirits, or at the very least. After other feast days, others used blessed chalk to mark entrances with begging, mischievous drafts. Candles performed a vital function in providing warmth and good fortune. Vigil candles were occasionally kept burning after being blessed by the village priest or the most devout elderly woman. A fading appeal against the icy darkness tearing at the walls, and of course, the absence of true winter persisted throughout the night. No promises were made during the prayer session, dear Lord. If you just get, I promise to treat my neighbor with more kindness tonight, even if they continue to take our. Turnip's faith was a daily urgent conversation that the peasants weren't inquiring about, not some abstract solace. Just surviving with a little food, some heat, and another day to muddle as luxury. It was just pure hope whispered into the smoke till spring shattered the icy hold on their small settlements. Rafters nestled beneath prickly sheets and entangled in panting prayers that miraculously sustained them despite all of their resourcefulness, prayers, and determination over the endlessly harsh winter nights. The truth that medieval peasants threw at winter was sometimes insufficient, and when winter prevailed, it didn't. Take a few unfortunate people. Entire families and entire communities vanished, them into quiet under a thick layer of snow and ice. Some winters were especially harsh, such as the notorious. Rains devastated crops during the Great Famine in 1315, causing livestock to suffer, and an already harsh existence became a slow-moving, grinding catastrophe due to the frigid temps. People were so in need that rumors circulated about their consuming shoe leather bark, and in the worst situations each. Failure to maintain the fire wasn't merely a bother, it was frequently a death sentence. Family huddled without the hearth's scant warmth. Neighbors would occasionally discover entire houses in spring bodies still locked together for the last time, in each other's icy grasp, as though attempting to exchange a bit more warmth till the very. In the event of severe snowfall or ice storms, end houses themselves may collapse, with the roof giving way. During a frigid night, it wasn't only disastrous, but frequently. It was also not a guarantee that you would die pushing yourself through thigh-deep snow to seek refuge from neighbors. Disease enjoyed the cold and starvation, especially if those neighbors were already overburdened. Compromised the body, and crowded, smoke-filled dwellings became havens for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other fatal diseases. A December cough might quickly turn into a funeral by January, followed by the silent horror of frostbite on fingers, toes, and even blackened ears. Some villagers survived the winters while still tied to their masters. A horrible badge of honor that read, "I made it through," at the expense of their limbs. However, winter stole a part of me. What's most unsettling isn't the death itself, but rather the uncanny normalcy of it. People came to terms with the fact that some of them wouldn't see Thor every winter. His passing wasn't shocking, it was just another. Despite the extreme cold, the neighbor at the door, covered in frost, is waiting its turn. Medieval peasants' persistent fear of death forced them to cling to life, since there would always be one breath hanging in the frigid air and one ember remaining in the hearth. Remains worth fighting when we consider the peasants of the Middle Ages, those. It's tempting to focus just on the struggles of these muddy, frost-bitten wintertime survivors, the cracked hands, the freezing. Huts were suffocated by smoke, But underlying all of that hardship, there was something considerably more potent, a legacy of unadulterated, unrelenting inventiveness and unshakable endurance. They lacked cozy memories and central heated jackets. They didn't even have the luxury of expecting that foam mattresses would last till spring. But what they did have, and what they left behind, was the resiliency blueprint found in every haystack mattress. Every moss-crammed wall gap and hand-banked fire was an example of human ingenuity. Despite being under siege and facing overwhelming odds, they managed to remain resilient. Desperation, they adjusted, and they gained knowledge from the earth, one another, and each harsh winter etched out painful lessons upon which their societies were based. They were founded on more than just common ground. They also taught one another survival skills. To keep an eye on the sick, gather supplies when food was running low, and have faith that aiding a neighbor who was freezing today meant someone. They lived by the principle that no one can overcome cold alone, and their faith was also gentle. Perhaps it may help you tomorrow. Of perseverance, people incorporate prayers into their everyday routines, not only out of fear, but also out of a flimsy, unyielding optimism that it might be a bit warmer tomorrow. A glimmer of optimism that, after 100 gloomy nights, spring would return and life would return, would somehow push through the icy ground, and it succeeded because of their sacrifices as a result of their modest triumphs, living another. Future generations prospered, bit by bit, as they pushed through one more storm that night. Before warmth and comfort became commonplace, humanity had to endure harsh winters during which their ancestors could hardly survive. Expectations rather than far-off aspirations, their sweat, blood, and creativity are woven seamlessly into our daily lives, every warm blanket, every house, every languid winter night, while drinking tea in the gentle lighting, is the outcome of innumerable medieval peasants' refusal to submit to the chilly. So perhaps the next time the wind howls outside your double-paned window, think about the anonymous brave individuals who transform shivering survival into a living legacy with just one ember. One breath, one uncooperative heartbeat at a time. And Berlin was not born with a crown on her head with troops at her feet. She was most likely born around 1501 at Blickling Hall, also known as He Castle, was the daughter of Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman, and Thomas Berlin, a driven diplomat, in the overall context of Tudor society, and is a woman with strong familial ties. Birth hardly made a difference, but something remarkable was growing from these humble beginnings. From a young age that would eventually change the trajectory of English history, Anne was distinguished not by her wealth, but rather by her intelligence, her spirit of wit, and by, according to stories, her family saw her talent and transported her to the continent where her formal schooling started when she worked for Margaret of Austria in the few English girls could have imagined the magnificent court of the Netherlands, where and learned the craft of the delicate dance of European politics and diplomatic etiquette were perfected in France, but Anne's intelligence was so refined that she worked in the affluent courts for years, of Nava Queens Marguerite and Claude acquiring the language of influence, while other young women were perfecting their charm and elegance, their needlework, and became an expert in conversational intrigue and the craft of. By the time she returned to England she was dominating attention without ever appearing to seek it, and was a unique woman who could compete with the elegance of European courtiers in the early 1520s. Even her admirers acknowledged that she wasn't a classic beauty despite having the aspirations of a rising English house. Much, but her dark eyes were fascinating and glowed with intelligence in a flash. Under layers of courtly grace, Anne's beautiful voice and purposeful movement were scarcely discernible. Didn't simply walk into rooms, she altered their gravitational balance at a moment when a woman's birth and marriage frequently sealed fate, but Anne refused to silently fade into obscurity since she had witnessed the power that intelligence and charm could be used in foreign courts, and she planned to apply that understanding at the time, and Berlin was still a young, astute, and unproven woman yet. The girl who returned to England was no longer just Thomas, and history was already starting to change around her. The daughter of Berlin was a participant in a bigger game that would soon take over the crown itself, and Berlin was unique when she returned to the English court. In a world full of humble, pale-faced English flowers, nobles had never seen Anne. Was she too unpredictable to ignore like a thunderstorm? She stood out from the kind, submissive women who occupied the king's court with her black hair, bold eyes, and sharp wit. She first performed the anticipated position of a maid of honor to Queen Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon, yet Anne's presence glowed like a candle even in the queen's shadow. Too intelligent to suppress, she laughed confidently, spoke French fluently, and danced elegantly. Few women dared to show off to males, and the court was silently buzzing about women's gossip. The attractive Berlin girl quickly attracted the most hazardous interest of all. The Henry VIII, the monarch himself, was no stranger to flirtation. His court was a haven for murmured assurances and a covert relationship, but Anne was unique. She didn't fall in love at his praises or leap into his arms with joy, as so many others had done. She challenged, she teased. Henry, a man accustomed to quick love, was enthralled with Anne's refusal, kept him close at hand, and as he slid farther, messages exchanged between them filled with expressions of affection, annoyance, and longing. Henry gave her the part of the most influential unofficial role at court is that of royal mistress, Anne. Amazingly, she refused to be a forgotten mistress lost to time or just another conquest. If Henry wanted her, he would need to marry her. It was such a bold risk that the court was taken aback because the king had already wed his queen. Catherine was adored by the populace, and her nephew the Holy Roman fiercely guarded her. Henry would need to disobey the church itself in order to claim, but didn't bat an eyelid because she had lived in the European courts, where queens used their soft power to paint smiles and conceal lace fans. She understood that ambition was a risky game, but she was playing it to win while standing in the candle-illuminated hallways of the English court, and Berlin decided not to be just respected, but to alter her fate and England's forever. What started as in King Henry VIII and in Berlin's passionate courtship quickly descended into a national emergency, and Henry wasn't just. He was so enamored that he was prepared to destroy everything in his quest for it. A minor obstacle to the king's want to wed Anne, which England had recognized for generations, was that he was. Catherine of Aragon, who was already married to her, refused to simply move aside. Catherine was dignified and resilient. For 20 years, she had been Henry's devoted wife, and in the eyes of God and the English, she was the legitimate. In addition to being scandalous, the Queen's divorce was practically unimaginable, but Henry was adamant that he deluded himself and attempted to persuade everyone else that his union with Catherine was doomed due to the fact that she had, having already been wed to his brother Arthur, despite the Pope's special authorization for their. Several years ago, Henry now maintained that unless he annulled, his soul would be doomed. For her part, and knew better than to come across as overly eager, so she kept herself just beyond of reach, supporting Henry's aspirations and keeping her distance at every turn. Everything she said was calculated. She wasn't just trying to get married. She was setting herself up to become queen of. England's court split into factions and murmurs, with some aristocratic families eagerly courted Anne's favor, while some clung tenaciously to the shifting winds of power. Queen Catherine dispatched frantic messages to Rome abroad, appalled at the thought of and taking the place of her diplomats. Henry's own advisors shifted uneasily as they sensed the earth quivering as monarchs promised reprisal. Henry's annoyance increased as the months passed into years beneath his feet. Flooded the Pope with petitions, tricked his attorneys into identifying weaknesses, and gradually started to understand that Catherine had strong allies and that the church would not be readily influenced. Henry persisted in challenging everyone, even her nephew Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. His relationship with and had been characterized by advice, tradition, and increasingly the law itself. transformed into something much more than a personal ambition. It was now a dispute to the very structure of ecclesiastical and political life in England, and wasn't merely winning over a king's affections. She was. There was no turning back now that a perilous game had started, pulling a whole kingdom into unknown waters. Returning after over 7 torturous years of scheming, scandal, and diplomacy. Turmoil in January 1533, and Boleyn's risk paid off when she wed Henry in secret. 8. A daring step considering that he was still legally wed to Catherine of, in the view of the Pope and a large portion of Europe, and was crowned queen in June, in a sumptuous ceremony at Westminster Abbey, England, which ought to have been the climax of her life, but the atmosphere was not at all happy, as Londoners watched with. Many mumbled prayers for Queen Catherine, while others applauded with tired eyes. Wondered if Anne, the new queen, was a blessing or a curse because of her French mannerisms and bold energy. Unlike Catherine, who personified queenship as a storm rather than a loving figure, and was brilliantly provocative and embodied the ancient English ideals of piety and humility. Being politically astute, she commanded the court with her vivid colors and intelligence and quickly created formidable adversaries in her position. Although it appeared safe, it was incredibly unstable because everything depended on one thing to give Henry, and was well aware that she was more than just Henry's lover and that she was a male heir. During the early stages of her pregnancy, and in Henry were the dynasty's hope, were overjoyed to learn that the child will be male, but September. To her credit, and disguised the fact that she had a daughter named Elizabeth in 1533. She expressed her heartbreaking disappointment with grace, stating that the next kid would undoubtedly be a son Henry, but she was less calm. His once adoring eyes flickered with doubt, but for a while, Anne's star remained burning brightly. Brilliantly, she changed the face of the English court by elevating her family to reaching previously unheard-of levels and becoming the first queen in English history to be crowned with the holy oil typically kept for. Foreign ambassadors sought her favor as a courier because of King's immense authority, rearranged alliances to win her favor, while the hitherto submissive Henry started to move. England formally separated from Rome, establishing the Church of England under his leadership, all in order for Anne's crown seemed unquestionable, yet even in her victory, ominous clouds formed. Henry was erratic, rivals circled impatiently, and pals muttered behind their hands. And had been the clever lady who had rebuilt the kingdom for him, but restless was already starting to see past her. Gained the throne, but maintaining it would need more than charm, ambition, or even. And Boleyn's love had risen higher than that of nearly every woman in her era. Yet the harsher the fall, the higher you go. Almost immediately after she put the crown on her head, she started to break. It started to reveal that Anne's troubles stemmed from the need to have her first child be a male heir. Despite being intelligent and in good health, Elizabeth was not Henry V's son. With dynastic dreams on the horizon and time running out, and endured numerous swift sequence of pregnancies, but grief ensued after miscarriages that each lost child chipped away at her, leaving her emotionally and physically weakened. Her foundation, which Henry had once been fervently committed to, started to erode, and is never one to suffer in silence, and his dissatisfaction is causing rifts between them. Battled to maintain her position, but Henry, a man who valued obedience as beauty, got weary of her acerbic nature and her refusal to submit to the very fire that had initially drew him in. Many nobles were gathered like wolves by adversaries outside the royal rooms, who gritted their teeth to put up with Anne's ascension and now openly plotted her demise. Even commoners whispered that Catherine of Aragon's supporters would never forgive, and for what they perceived to be robbery and sacrilege, accusing her of being the great accusing her of causing the split with Rome, and the harsh adjustments that ensued, and later Jane Seymour's gentle demureness, and was. Henry's wandering attention was drawn to Jane, just as Anne's influence started to grow, where Anne had captivated him with. Jane's challenge and intellect provided calming compliance, yet it was a risky change. As astute as ever, and saw it coming and attempted to take her back. Position giving Henry a lot of attention, promising additional boys, and pleading for patience. However, the erratic king had already started to envision his existence without the woman. He had once destroyed a country for whom Anne's political adversaries were. When Thomas Cromwell's ally realized the tide was turning, they started establishing the foundation for a destructive campaign that stealthily gathers charges, rumors, and observes Anne, the lady who had so skillfully played the risky game of ambition, losing ground, had used bravery and guile to win her throne, but in the harsh, changing world of Henry's court, prior triumphs were inconsequential. Only recent triumphs were significant. As the queen who had destroyed a nation sharpened her blades, Anne's adversaries would soon discover how swiftly a kingdom could destroy her. But in Boleyn's adversaries came with whispers and secrets rather than armies and swords. And meticulously honed lies in the court's back rooms, treachery was simmering. Thomas Cromwell, formerly Anne's strongest English ally, was a silent patient who died. Their relationship had been founded on shared ambition, but now their objectives conflicted, and reformation had turned against her, and favored changes to aid the underprivileged and curtail the influence of avaricious aristocrats. Cromwell desired Henry's favor, stability, and an end to Anne's. Her audacity had made her dangerous, and love had curled in Henry's erratic heart. There were not many actual pals for Anne, who was irritated, suspicious, and detached. Her strongest weapon, which had once been her attractiveness, now irritated the courts. Desire for a softer, more accommodating Queen and Jane Seymour's calm cunning waited just out of sight, creating the ideal contrast with Anne's dying fire. Knowing that Henry was agitated and that the monarch desired to leave, but had no practical way to do so, Cromwell took the initiative. Cromwell provided an explanation. But what if Anne could be taken away without a divorce? Which would make Henry look foolish, but the charges were so outrageous that they were even. Conspiracy of adultery and incest against the monarch and Anne, the haughty and intelligent queen. Seen as a treacherous seductress and danger to the very throne, she once reinterpreted Cromwell's meticulously compiled proof that turns courtly flirtations into damaging testimony while coercing admissions under torture. The charges led to the arrest of other persons, including Anne's own brother George Boleyn. Seemed illogical and full of contradictions and impossibilities, yet in Henry's court, truth was whatever the monarch required it to be, and Anne could feel the noose getting tighter. Battled valiantly, and invoked Henry's recollection of their previous love. Shared, but the man who had previously ripped England apart for her was now useless. Unable to look her in the eyes in May 1536, and was taken into custody and brought to the. As the huge gate of the Tower of London slammed behind her, she saw that she was not. She was imprisoned in the cruel game she had once played and was no longer a queen. Betrayal had sealed her doom, and she was now alone in the Tower, and Boleyn stood in the big hall, waiting for the last move. Face a court of aristocrats from the Tower of London, many of whom owed their very titles and wealth to her ascent, but now they sat in judgment, icy and wary. The accusations against the woman who had previously altered England's course were startling, and they were meant to destroy her. She committed high treason by having affairs with several men, including her own brother George Boleyn. In a different universe, charges against a queen would have been considered conspiracy against the monarch. Unimaginable, but now they were just putting on a gloomy show at the theater. Intended to provide Henry VII with the exact outcome he desired, Anne's demise wrapped in and used the same fire that had previously won Henry's favor to defend herself under the thin cover of legality. With wisdom, accuracy, and an unshakable heart, she refuted every claim. Poise that even her adversaries were shocked by, reminding them that she had been adorned with holy oil selected by. Reminding them of her devotion to God, she was crowned Queen of England. Gives up her love, but it was all in vain because the decision had already been made. The trial was a spectacle for the court and the public long before, and entered the courtroom. Witness after witness of a once unbreakable woman being forced, or dates and locations that opposed one other's testimony were said by bribed individuals. Was tenuous when it did exist, but the fact didn't matter because George, her brother, was found guilty, and the other males who were charged with her were also given death sentences, and would be executed by beheading, which is a more humane punishment than the typical. When the verdict was read, the traitor was executed by hanging, drawing, and quartering. Did not shatter, standing erect with a pale face but a determined spirit. Intact in the last few seconds before being escorted back to her cell, she made a strong statement stating that she was ready to pass away and pleaded for God to spare her soul as the huge hall doors. The court breathed a sigh of relief as it closed behind her, and had been outstanding during the storm. Even though the perilous unforgettable was almost over, they still didn't get it. They were immortalizing in Berlin's treachery rather than eliminating her. Tragedy, and in legend, and Berlin was brought back after her trial to the Tower of London as a condemned prisoner rather than as the victorious queen who had already ruled England. Even though and was near death, she refused to give up in the freezing echo, and spent hours praying and preparing herself in the tower's hallways. With her hands clenched securely and her voice steady, she was kneeling on the hard stone floors. She claimed she was not terrified of dying, and confessed to no crimes since she thought she had committed none. Hoped that her passing would bring about world peace, and possibly show her young daughter some mercy. The few people who had remained faithful to Elizabeth cried in private, as did her women in waiting. Instead of the other way around, and consoled them, occasionally, she made sour jokes. The obstinate flame that had made her a queen was the knowledge that she would be remembered as having lost her mind in her black humor. In the meantime, the legendary Henry VIII showed no mercy. He had already. Henry focused on Jane Seymour even before Anne's execution date was set. Henry was making arrangements for Anne's subsequent marriage, this last betrayal from the man who had once torn. On May 18, 1536, and must have suffered the sharpest wound of all, losing a country, was informed that she would pass away the following morning, but she didn't get any sleep that night. Prayed in her last hours, pleading with God to pardon her for the wrongs done to her and possibly for herself. The pride and desire that brought her here, Henry, with a glimmer of royalty. A French swordsman was sent by goodwill to perform the execution more quickly, cleanly, and brutally than an axe. Perhaps more for the king's conscience than for Anne's, it was a little act of kindness. Just at dawn, and meticulously put on a dark gray gown for her last moments. Fur-trimmed damask with a red kirt underneath the dignified colors of. She prepared to make a sacrifice by tucking her dark hair under a plain cap. As the chilly morning mist from the tower swirled around the courtyard stones and faced the blade gracefully, there wouldn't be any tears as the Berlin Queen Mother survival fighter went forward. No, just one more brave deed in the face of history's condemnation of her demise. Was close, but on the morning of May 19th, her narrative was only getting started. And Berlin climbed the scaffold inside the walls of the Tower of London in 1536. Courtiers, guards, a few witnesses, and a small group of people gathered in quiet, and stood erect in her gray gown, as though the stone walls themselves held their breath. Her face was calm but pale, and she appeared thinner than she had at court, fluttering slightly in the chilly morning breeze. Were no weeping or hysteria. If anything, she confronted death in the same way. She spoke carefully and briefly, with a steely dignity that had once brought a kingdom to its knees. In her parting remarks, she refrained from making accusations and defending herself. Prayed for the king, the man who had deserted her in those last moments, to be healthy and prosperous. Anne's bravery astounded everyone by offering the world forgiveness rather than a confession. The people the French executioner had brought specifically to guarantee a speedy death rushed forward to witness her fall. With her hands folded in prayer and her gaze raised towards the heavens, she stayed motionless while a tiny piece of white fabric was put across her eyes. Once silent, The blade flashed quickly, and in Berlin, the Queen Mother and history creator wasn't. Additionally, she was promptly laid to rest in an arrow box in an unmarked burial inside the castle grounds because a queen once crowned in gold had no fitting coffin ready for her. Let to disappear without a funeral. Yet Anne's tale did not end there, because her daughter Elizabeth survived. One of the greatest kings in English history would be the child whose birth had once let a king down. History of the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I, whose reign would witness the emergence of English artistic dominance and worldwide impact through a queen who inherited her. Anne Boleyn transformed the world with her mother's fiery personality, brilliant intelligence, and unwavering resilience. Her aspirations contributed to the rupture with Rome and the establishment of the Church of England, changing the history of England forever. Fall shown to the world that even queens may be disregarded, yet Elizabeth Anne's legacy endures via her blood. Shined more brilliantly than any crown she had ever worn in her life, and in Berlin ultimately prevailed. A sort of immortality, not because she lived, but because of her lasting influence on. The American colonies were simmering like a pot by the early 1770s. The once proud mother country's relationship with Britain had eroded over a long period of time. 2 years earlier had not been the beginning of the animosity, suspicion, and rising rage. The Stamp Act, which imposed tariffs on everything from playing cards to newspapers, had infuriated colonists. The Townshend Acts, which imposed taxes on necessities like paint, paper, and glass, came next. Every new rule enacted by a parliament thousands of miles distant, where colonists were not represented, was similar to. Anger initially manifested itself when another spark fell into dry bush. Colonial assemblies created formal petitions and vehement pamphlets. Boycotts were organized by merchants to protest, and authors like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson argued fervently for liberty and liberties in newspapers, but as time went on, frustration gradually came to the realization that Britain wasn't paying attention, and much worse, that Britain didn't give a damn. The colonists held on to the belief that if they made enough noise and used enough logic, Parliament would abolish taxes, and occasionally they did. For example, the Stamp Act was infamously repealed after clamorous colonial protests, yet each minor triumph was followed by new laws, new taxes, and insults, but the money wasn't the main focus. By British standards, the taxes themselves were always rather low. The idea that the colonists were being taxed without their consent and treated more like subjects then. Boston's residents ruled more like remote property than collaborators. Any other city turned into the center of the Sons of Liberty's rebellion. Tensions around 1770 saw a covert, flaming group of patriots become more vocal and audacious. Erupted into violence during the Boston Massacre, when British soldiers opened fire on defenseless people. Blood had already discolored the cobblestones, and by 1773, the colonies were in danger of collapsing. They were on the verge of open defiance after a final insult, but it did not. In the guise of troops, new regulations, or armies, but in the silent, seemingly innocuous form of containers filled with. Although the colonists were unaware of it at the time, tea floated in the cold that night. The world will forever change in 1773 when Parliament made a crucial decision about the waters of Boston Harbor. They made a mistake and approved the Tea Act, a statute that assumed the American colonies would absorb cheaper tea in silence. Was intended to reaffirm Britain's claim over the ailing British East India Company, and incidentally, on paper, taxing the colonies seemed like a good idea, and the Tea Act permitted the enterprise to cut out the middlemen and sell tea directly to the colonies, lowering prices and providing a luxury thing at a discount, a few pennies less expensive, but what could go wrong? All because the Tea Act's underlying principle, rather than the tea's price, was the issue, leaving the dreaded tax on tea firmly established. Accepting the tea, even at a reduced price, would entail recognizing Parliament's authority to impose taxes. The colonies without many Americans' approval, which was unimaginable. Release of the freedoms they had battled to defend for over 10 years. The Tea Act's news spread like. All across the colonies, merchants were incensed because they perceived a monopoly as a threat to their livelihoods. Destroy local trade patriots who were furious at the secret message that the monarch continued to accept. It was free to do as it pleased in Boston, where the response was particularly harsh and the city was already damaged by the. Following the Boston Massacre and years of financial suffering, Bostonians realized that the Tea Act was a ruse. Refusing the tea turned into a test of honor and a bargain. Devotion to the cause of liberty, public gatherings, newspaper columns, and fiery rhetorical organizations such as Samuel Adams' Sons of Liberty and others were. Boycotts promising not to dump or sell any tea from the East India Company. Consumed on American territory across the colonies, ships transporting the contentious tea were. Rejected by local opposition in ports ranging from Charleston to New York, the message was unambiguous: we will not be purchased. But destiny took a different turn in Boston. 3 vessels, the Beaver, Ella Lenina, and Dartmouth, arrived anchored in the harbor, refusing to depart, and royal officials demanded that the tea be. The colonists refused to unload, resulting in a standstill that developed into a drawn boring. A single act would end the unconscionable tension, and history would never be the same once more, with the British tea ship obstinately moored in Boston Harbor. The city itself became an explosive keg with each day that went by without resolution. Increased the strain because Boston wasn't merely opposing, it was getting ready. Anger-filled colonists argued for a fight in bars, churches, and public squares. How should the Sons of Liberty, led by ferocious individuals like Samuel Adams John, proceed? Paul Revere and Hancock organized resistance quickly, posting on social media advertisements urging people to boycott British tea, and hosted raucous gatherings that attracted farmers, craftspeople, and every meeting of merchants fueled the ancient South meeting's flames. With thousands of people packed into the wooden hall and their breath obscuring the air, the house turned into the resistance's nerve center. Resolutions were passed despite their voices rising in protest. Every vote against the unloading of tea was a further blow to the British, and speeches were exchanged and tempers ran high. Authority, but time was running out while Bostonians stood together. British legislation required the unloading and payment of taxes on imported products, such as tea. After 20 days, if the ships were still there beyond the customs inspector's deadline, the Sons of Liberty understood that the shipment would be seized and that the levy would be recovered by force. That the principal would be lost once the tax was paid, even if it was protested, was more about whether the colonies would tolerate being treated as subjects without rights than it was about the tea anymore, or if they would take a stand and defend their future. In the meanwhile, the royal governor of Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts dug in his heels and wouldn't allow the tea ships to go without unloading their goods, insisting that the law be followed. Damn him to colonial indignation. Resigning means acknowledging that the colonies of Boston were governed by mobs rather than kings. Every man, woman, and kid saw the standoff turn into a spectacle and sensed that something was about to happen. When the globe takes its breath, it would just take a cold, acute sense before a storm. Was all it took for an explosion to start, and somewhere in the congested streets and hearts of Boston was discreetly formulating a scheme that would reverberate across oceans. And on December 16, 1773, the daybreak over Boston was gray and chilly. For almost 3 weeks, the city hovered on the brink of history, with the tea ships sitting in. The final deadline had arrived, and the harbor was like ticking time bombs. According to British law, if it wasn't customs, the tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of the ship's arrival. Everyone was aware that authorities may confiscate the goods and dispatch British troops to uphold the law. Everyone was aware that the concept would be lost if the tea came ashore. The colonists' claim to liberty and liberties would be undermined that morning if they permitted it even after their cause. The Old South Meeting House, the biggest structure in Boston, was crowded with thousands of Bostonians and neighboring colonies. To attend the conference, some people traveled miles across the freezing countryside. Was crammed with people that men poured out into the streets to listen to the blazing. Speeches from Samuel Adams, the iron voice of revolt, reverberated down the corridors. Oversaw the event, and each speaker stood up to condemn the Tea Act and voice their opposition to tyranny, to demand quick action, but uncertainty persisted despite the defiance. However, how could they do it without starting a full-scale conflict? As the afternoon drew on, riders galloped to halt the tea without unleashing a torrent of vicious reprisal. Governor Thomas Hutchinson was unaffected by the sobering news that the ships would not be permitted to go without. The tax collected under King's law would be confiscated when the tea was unloaded. Suddenly, the meeting house's walls appeared to tremble under the force of the enraged mob. But Samuel Adams said the final words to terminate the debate while remaining composed. Everyone understood the meaning of the simple sentence, yet this assembly can do nothing more to save the nation. No more petitions, no more concessions, and no action would be. Captured outside a battle yell that sliced through the growing darkness as the signal men swiftly covered their faces with soot, draping blankets and feathers in a rudimentary Mohawk impersonation. Warriors, the goal was to create a sign and a statement that no one could misunderstand. Boston would respond without using words if it were thought that the deadline had passed. With resistance as Boston's twilight became darker on December 16th. In 1773, the silent streets started to hum as shadowy individuals emerged. Ordinary folks wearing scratchy blankets, some with feathers on their faces, some with soot-blackened faces. They used a symbolic disguise in an attempt to trick people into thinking they were actual Mohawks. Act of letting go of their previous identities and standing as something new and forceful by the dozens they created. Traveling to Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 tea vessels, the Beaver, the Dartmouth, and Eleanor, were anchored. There was no shouting, and the harbor water churned dark and chilly beneath them, heavy with the winter air's keen bite. Drunken mayhem, this was a mission executed with composure and brutality, not a riot. The colonists in disguise, equipped with clubs and hatchets, rushed the ships, overtaking the few remaining crewmen. The sailors were unharmed. As the operation started, they were shoved aside and silently observed as the guys divided. Others used trained blows to open the wooden boxes, releasing the aroma of freshly brewed tea into the chilly night air. Hauled the boxes overboard, leaving behind thunderous splashes that reverberated around the harbor's calm waters, chest after chest 342 in. Thousands of pounds of tea leaves flowed in the dark water after the total was broken and discarded. British guards positioned nearby created noise while onlookers silently observed from the battlefield. There is still no action to stop the violence, whether out of sympathy or confusion. It's uncertain, but some reports indicate that even British loyalists understood something had changed and, tonight, there would be no halting it because of the tremendous discipline. Only the tea, the despised emblem, was taken from the ships. No one else raided them for goods. Of British oppression was targeted in a place where the men had to deal with starvation and misery on a daily basis. Could have easily used the demonstration as a pretext to steal, but they refrained. Looked like a massive whirling cauldron full of ripped cloth as it was over the harbor. The scent of the sea combined with the harsh tang of broken tea fills the night air with a mixture of chests and soaking tea leaves. The work was completed quietly, and the guys vanished into a weird, bittersweet fragrance. The night, disappearing into Boston's back streets and alleyways, leaving no leaders, no names, and no claims to fame in their wake. As the final shattered containers bobbed in the air, just the obvious sign of revolution, the Boston Tea Party stood motionless in the murky sea, nearly holding its breath. Wasn't a brawl, riot, or drunken spectacle. Rather, it was something much more uncommon and, under the cover of darkness, an act of cold, willful defiance turned the harbor into a gigantic swirling. Large mats of teapots containing thousands of pounds of East India Company tea drifted on the Some inquisitive and disobedient colonists scooped handfuls of the black-stained water, of soggy leaves from the harbor, only to be reprimanded by the Sons of Liberty who were on guard around the docks. Saved, nobody would benefit from the effort done this evening. This was a pure principle and, simply put, news spread like wildfire when the town woke up the following morning to the lingering scent of salty tea. By noon, everyone, from merchants to apprentices, had huge sheets of mouth letters, realized what had occurred, and patriots' views quickly diverged. Pride, a ferocious, swollen pride that common men had confronted the largest empire in the globe and delivered a blow to liberty among moderates and loyalists. They were horrified by the careless property destruction. Governor Thomas Hutchinson was furious because the colonies had gone too far and couldn't turn back. His mansion was incensed at the message it conveyed, as well as the damage. Where else would revolt occur if the king's authority could be so flagrantly disregarded in Boston? British officials were taken aback by the spark. Perhaps they had anticipated demonstrations and boycotts. They didn't anticipate another organized, disciplined riot like to those that had erupted over the Stamp Act. Tens of thousands of pounds of royal goods were peacefully destroyed by revolutionaries without even smashing a window. The captains of the Dartmouth, Elenina, and Beaver ships were powerless to stop the disappearance of their cargo. Under the waters, the night's loss would be recorded at more than 10,000 pounds. British pounds was a fortune, but the actual loss was either ruined or not quantified in pounds sterling. Tea was based on devotion and confidence in the flimsy delusion that Britain. The night the tea sunk somewhere, she continued to control her colonies with acquiescence. A common, indisputable truth emerged from deeper, the era of tranquil. A reckoning was imminent. The protest was drawing to a close, and Boston was prepared when news of. When the Boston Tea Party arrived in London after crossing the Atlantic, the British responded quickly and angrily. Officials said it was more than just a protest. It was an open challenge to revolt. To unavoidable royal power, King George III, after learning that. It was reported that the news had become icy with rage, and the Parliament was already annoyed by. Outrage over years of colonial disobedience erupted, and they sought punishment rather than only for Boston, but as a warning to all American colonies. The outcome was a set of extremely strict restrictions. The first blow fast came, and they were soon dubbed the unforgivable actions in America. In a cruel move, Parliament mandated the closure of Boston Port Act. Boston's busy harbor served as the city's economic backbone until the demolished. After the tea was paid for and the order was restored, ships were unable to enter. Boston used to be lively and raucous, but the trade dried up and the commodities and supplies disappeared. Became eerily silent on its docks, but the punishment continued. The colony's right to self-government was taken away by the Massachusetts Government Act firmly. The Administration of Justice Act permitted royal officials who were nominated by the king to offenses to be tried in Britain, sending a strong message that British officials were unassailable and to ensure because the colonies were aware that using force was a possibility, British soldiers were stationed all over Boston, living among the extremely. They were supposed to suppress the populace because it was obvious that revolt would be. The Crown would no longer allow the luxury of crushed liberty, yet Parliament's hard hand had an unforeseen consequence. The news of Boston's suffering infuriated the other colonies rather than intimidating them into surrender. Caused great sympathy when its port was closed and its citizens were starving under martial law. Wagon loads of food and supplies from nearby colonies streamed into Boston amid the righteous rage that swept across America. The formerly divided colonies started to come together through secret meetings, messages of encouragement, and promises of togetherness. Collectively, what had started out as a Massachusetts issue was quickly turning into an American one in terms of punishment. Instead of making an example of them, as Britain had anticipated, Boston a rallying call for resistance to the once flickering flames of revolution, now started to burn from colony to colony in isolated areas, and there would be Boston's punishment spread shockwaves well beyond the rocky beaches of Boston, making it difficult to put them out. For years, the outrage in Massachusetts and the other 13 colonies became a much greater threat to Britain's union. The colonies had behaved like estranged relatives, arguing and competing despite their differences in geography, religion, and rivals in trade. But when Parliament closed Boston's harbor and the self-governance of Massachusetts let people around the continent realize that if it could happen to Boston, it could occur to anyone in the states of Virginia, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and New Hampshire. Colonists responded quickly, sending wagons loaded with food. Town meetings were humming with rage as supplies and letters of solidarity were sent to the suffering people of Boston. Newspaper printers put in endless hours to disseminate the word that the battle was no longer just Boston's. It was now everyone's. Thus, in September 1774, an extraordinary event occurred, the first. Representatives from 12 of the 13 continental congresses met for the first time in Philadelphia. To consider a coordinated reaction, colonists like George Washington, Patrick, Henry John, and others convened under one roof. Once only local leaders, Adams and Samuel Adams now stood together as founders of a movement that was expanding daily. Their objective was not yet fully achieved, at least not formally. Most people still hoped for reconciliation and a return to the previous relationship after independence. Mutual respect under the British Crown, but there is more going on behind the courteous arguments and well-crafted petitions. As understanding grew, the colonies realized they could no longer afford to attend the Congress separately. They promised to help one another in the event of additional British aggression, and they committed to a widespread boycott of British goods. Made it apparent that any assault on one colony would be interpreted as an assault on all of them. Throughout the continent, common people started utilizing terms that were previously exclusively murmured in pubs and meeting places, bringing the hammer down on liberty in private unity resistance. Instead of suppressing insurrection as Boston, Britain had hoped, it brought the colonies together. Despite their differences, a group of people were starting to consider joining forces to create something even more threatening. Themselves as Americans and the winds of revolution rather than as dispersed regions, weren't only stirring anymore. They were building into a storm, and Britain couldn't stop it in time. Not only were the crates lost when the tea sunk into Boston Harbor, but the American. The Boston Tea Party ignited a light that no king, no army, and no distance could extinguish, allowing colonists to remain faithful subjects forever. Parliament could never put out the spark that was ignited in the months that followed. What started off as protests, boycotts, and courteous petitions became into outright resistance as fire spread over the colonies. Town militias started shooting at powder-filled storehouses in the open. Under the same roofs in Boston, men who had previously hailed King George III in bars were now discussing revolution. Became an emblem of sacrifice that was beaten but unflappable the more Britain attempted to. The more the colonies slipped through its fingers, the more tightly it held on to each ship that passed the Boston's closed, quiet harbor served as a somber warning that tyranny has found an equal in American society. Disobedience when Parliament introduced the Intolerable Acts, intending to use Boston as a model to frighten the. Rather than subduing neighboring colonies, they established a martyr city. Rallying cry from Georgia to New Hampshire, colonists understood that resistance was essential to their future. By spring, it was about survival, identity, and independence rather than tea. In the communities outside of Boston, the tension peaked in 1775. Lexington and defeated British forces dispatched to seize colonial munitions. Instead discovered armed farmers, regular men prepared to use muskets to protect their rights. The American Revolution's opening shots were fired in a straight line that was traced. Reminisce about the day when men poured a fortune's worth of tea into the world learnt during the Boston Tea Party that revolutions don't necessarily be heralded with trumpets and banners. Sometimes it begins softly with a few committed individuals. standing in the cold and dropping the tea out of defiance rather than fear. The colonists were opposing an empire as well as invasions, even though one thing had become evident that night in Boston Harbor. The American road ahead would be bloody, bitter, and uncertain. Colonies were something new. They were no longer obedient subjects. They were revolutionaries, dangerous, and only getting started, all prior to the imposing Giza pyramids, before Mesopotamian towns were humming with. Before Stonehenge loomed over the sky, Corral was tucked away in the nearly 5,000 years ago. The dry valleys of coastal Peru's Corral rose in hushed majesty, then vanished into almost total forgetfulness, engulfed by sands and forgotten by. For centuries, the world was unaware of the existence of the Super Valley. At first appearance, the area where Carroll previously flourished appears to be an unusual location for civilization to flourish. For the majority of people, the arid, desolate river is little more than a slender silver thread that winds over dust and boulders. Appeared hostile, a place where life had left it, but it was there in the midst of the emptiness. When one of the first big cities in human history emerged, Corral wasn't merely a transient trading post or a scattering of huts. It was a planned city spanning more than 150 acres full of. It featured residential areas, plazas, pyramids, and ceremonial areas. Magnitude, goal, and ambition of a sophisticated culture that flourished centuries before the. Without a wheel, the Carroll people were able to build their own pyramids by stacking stones. Without the use of written language or metal instruments, they constructed enormous constructions out of stone and earth with only human intellect, teamwork, and the unadulterated strength of human will, but for thousands of. Even when travelers stumbled, Carroll's presence was kept a secret for years. They thought the odd weathered mounds strewn over the valley were simply hills or other natural formations. Nobody knew that one of the oldest towns in the world was hidden beneath the sand, sculpted by the desert winds. Until the late 20th century, the world existed before even the civilizations that history books had declared to be the first century in which Ruth Shady's team of archaeologists discovered the truth about what they discovered buried in time's dust would change the America's history and have everyone reevaluate their assumptions about the origins of civilization. In complete secrecy, Carroll had risen, prospered, and collapsed. Currently, its stones are whispering again after millennia of silence about. A universe of intricacy and splendor was created by a peaceful, educated people in a region where it seemed impossible to live, and this was just the start of their. At first glance, the Sup Valley appears to be a site where severe winds should make it difficult for life to exist. The sun cruelly beats down on infinite expanses of stone and sand. Water is limited, the river is meandering, and the earth is drying out, turning the landscape into cracked, brittle sheets. To the untrained view, it appears to be a desolate wasteland where a thread is struggling for survival. The gods had forgotten it, but the people of Corral noticed something odd. They recognized the river, albeit it was small, and instead of seeing a desert to be dreaded, they saw a canvas to be formed. The foundation of opportunity, therefore with perseverance, creativity, and sheer tenacity, they achieved their first triumph by transforming this harsh environment into a flourishing haven of life and culture. Was agriculture. They discovered how to control the yearly floods of the river by constructing basic, but ingenious irrigation systems that distributed water throughout the valley bottom, when others observed dust and sand. Cotton beans squashed guava sweet potatoes cotton in green buds of hope. Specifically, it became their treasure and was woven into fabrics and fishing nets, fostering relationships and trade with coastal communities that extended well beyond their desert home. But cultivating crops was. The Corral people's understanding that balance was necessary for surviving in the desert was only a portion of their skill. They used stone and soil to build their dwellings and plazas, not fighting nature. Made to resist the intense heat as well as the infrequent, harsh rainstorms that occasionally swept across the valley. They planned their harvests with the accuracy of a master by studying the seasons and constellations. The dried fish trade among astronomers became the lifeblood of Corral's commerce. Handmade items and cotton fruits were flowing up and down the coast. Carol received unusual and exotic items in return, including vibrant shells from the Pacific. Ideas from far-off peoples and stones from the Andes. They weren't alone, they were. Carol flourished in a place where it appeared impossible to survive. Instead of using force to subdue the desert, they collaborated with it through intelligence, invention, and community. Understanding its rhythms and honoring its authority helped to create a civilization that was more than just functional. But despite the obstacles, Carol developed into a civilizational lighthouse, and it was just getting started. To emerge from the desert like the ancient guardians of the Corral pyramids, contradict all of our preconceived notions of early American civilization. These were enormous, purposeful pieces of architecture rather than little, rudimentary constructions made by unsophisticated hands. The city's focal point was established by a group of people with vision, organization, and ambition. The biggest of Corral's colossal constructions is the Pyramid Mayor. Towered almost 60 feet above the sand and was more than 450 feet long. Floor, a technical achievement comparable to the ancient world's early wonders. The pyramid was constructed with stone mud and woven reed sacks loaded with rocks, intended to survive the violent earthquakes that occasionally rumbled, as well as the harsh climate. The area and persevered in standing motionless against the wind and the passage of time for almost 5 millennia, but unlike the enormous pyramids of Carol, the pyramids were not tombs. Egyptian burial complexes, Carol's pyramids had a distinct function. They were hubs of ceremonial authority and the summits of public life. Temples and gathering places are reachable by fires used to burn on top of these platforms in wide, graceful staircases. Ceremonies were conducted at the base of the enormous pyramids under the unending Peruvian sky. Sunken and circular plazas opened, beckoning hundreds to congregate for political gatherings, religious rites, and public festivities, the very blueprint of Carol's. The cityscape revealed a culture that valued order and community, with people who were closely related to one another and to smaller apartment buildings spread out around the pyramids, probably housing. The pyramids themselves appeared to be inhabited by priests, bureaucrats, artisans, and farmers, have been deliberately positioned to coincide with astronomical occurrences such as sunrises, solstices, and star cycles. Among the inhabitants of Corral, building was not only useful but also spiritual, mathematical, and cosmic. Today, it's nearly impossible to avoid feeling awed by the aged stones that these constructions were built upon. They rose despite lacking the wheel, metal tools, and beasts of burden. With remarkable accuracy and symmetry, the huge pyramids of Corral were constructed to bridge the gap between the ground and the sky, not for ego or warfare. Humanity, eternity, and the cosmos, and they continue to whisper across. Amidst the rubble of Corral, the sands tell a story that will never be forgotten. There is a significant distinction that distinguishes it from many ancient. There are no defensive walls encircling its plazas, no mass burials, and no weapons discovered buried beneath its dunes. Barring violent conquest or internal conflict, Carol was a society as opposed to the kingdoms that arose and collapsed via conflict. It's a surprising discovery that this was a civilization founded on peace, that thrived via collaboration, trade, and sharing rather than conflict. Believe that the people of Corral appear to have focused their energies on astronomy and building rather than armies or fortifications. Their plazas and pyramids weren't symbols of triumph, they were symbols of music and social life. Over adversaries, they served as hubs for governance, worship, and celebration. This was a civilization that decided to negotiate rather than destroy trade, to assemble rather than conquer. Cotton cultivated along the lush riverbanks was the foundation of Carol's prosperity and was turned into fishing nets. They were exchanged for dried fish, a vital source of coastal towns' goods. Carol. Protein and unique products from distant locations as well as vibrant Pacific shells. Unique tropical fruits from far away, as well as priceless stones from the highlands. Valleys, this extensive commerce network bound the area together. Distant communities into a harmonious network of reciprocal advantages, and in the middle, Carroll prospered as a center of culture, commerce, religion, and, in order to preserve social harmony, the city's expansive public areas and subterranean plazas relied heavily on ceremonial life. Probably acted as platforms for ceremonies that brought people together around common spiritual ideas. Music permeated these events. The soundscapes produced by drums constructed from deer hides and flutes carved from condor bones reverberated throughout the. Additionally, desert linking people's lives to something higher seemed to depend less on the military strength and more on civic organization and spiritual authority. The city's leaders need to have synchronized large-scale building projects, intricate trading, and cyclical agricultural cycles. Deals, all while preserving the terrible wounds of conflict in a historic. Corral serves as a bright exception to a world that is so frequently characterized by turmoil. Reminder that civilization can be created by the conquered and does not have to be constructed on their broken backs. At Carroll, the stone still appeared to be the silent force of cooperation, creativity, and trust. To reverberate with remnants of a past world that was more than a city of structures and trade, the city was a hive of ceremonial sound, spiritual rhythms, and archaeologists meticulously excavated the Carroll civilization, which was infused with ritual. The parched sands and revealed a wealth of prehistoric instruments, including flutes made from condor bones and small drums stretched with animal hides and pelican whistles made from deer antlers were not basic toys that were meticulously made and matched to particular sounds in order to transport sound through the city's expansive plazas in a world without written language. Imagine the low throb of drums increasing as music communicated the language of the soul. Like the desert wind's foot trampling on the sunken plazas, flutes sharp at sunset. Fires would crackle atop the pyramid platforms as hundreds gathered beneath the waning light, with priests wearing. In those times when Carroll wasn't there, elaborately woven clothing would chant to the gods of the river, the land, and the heavens. Simply a city, it was a symphony, and Corral's design itself implies that ceremony. Grand plazas were more than just open areas. They were the center of life. Stages for group rituals that are thoughtfully planned to bring people together. Like ancient amphitheaters, underground circular courts directed sight and sound towards the ceremonies held at their centers, and all of the pyramids towered over them, not as graves but as human-made sacred mountains that connect the ground to the heavens are used in rituals. Probably signaled the change of seasons, the planting and harvesting cycles, the motions of the stars, and the absence of music. Only amusement, it served as a link between humans and the natural world, between the familiar and the mysteries without cruel gods of war, violent murals, or sacrifices made at Corral. The heavenly realm appears to have been peaceful. Even now, as the desert wind rustles across the remains, you can still feel the joy and respect. I could really hear the faint sounds of old music, the lost melodies of A. Carroll was more than just a location for those who discovered beauty, purpose, and connection in the middle of the harsh, unending sands. It was an engineering marvel that was a tribute to the commerce and ritual of music. Without metal tools, human inventiveness in one of the world's most hostile environments. The people of Carroll created a city of stone and earth that has virtually survived without the wheel or draft animals. Their accomplishments over the course of 5,000 years were astounding. Enormous pyramids emerged from the desert floor was built using massive stones that were transported across the arid valley rather than tiny, brittle bricks. Workers used reed sacks and clever baskets that were sturdy enough to move rocks. Carry bulky loads made from the very plants that flourished along the riverbanks, which they constructed with layers upon layers. Careful stone stacking and debris filling to build constructions that could endure not only time, but the wrath of nature, which they comprehended well, is contained in a area that frequently experiences strong earthquakes, but their plazas and pyramids have mostly withstood. Intact how builders employed flexible techniques to master earthquake-resistant building. Building methods include rounded edges, wide foundations, and layered fillings that made it possible for their monuments to absorb and release seismic energy. This engineering was innovative and not based on textbooks. Water management was another quiet victory derived from a deep understanding of the ground itself. Despite being in a desert, the Carol people created highly advanced irrigation systems, canals and channels that meticulously directed river water to their fields, enabling crops to thrive even. No water was wasted during dry seasons. Every drop mattered in the corral's design. Itself demonstrated excellent urban planning, with large buildings lining up with important astronomical sites, indicating a profound comprehension of the solar cycles. The sunken plazas accurate. More than just meeting spots, geometry served as a tool for monitoring the skies, enabling astronomers and priests to forecast seasons that are essential for survival. Even the city's organization mentioned residential zones that are part of a complex civilization. The ceremonial centers and administrative spaces were all set up harmoniously, striking a balance. Community life with hallowed areas they constructed, not only temporarily but permanently. As contemporary engineers marvel at Corral's tenacity, generations today, reminded that excellence can sometimes be evaluated by more than just technology. Sometimes, the greatest insight comes from knowing the Corral stones are the result of natural processes acting in harmony with the soil rather than against it. Withstand earthquakes, storms, and the passage of time itself, they serve as a silent reminder of a. For ages, the city of Carol was a civilization that carved their dreams into the desert sands. Blossomed amid the desert as a ray of serenity, music, commerce, and architectural skill. Sands, and then it was abandoned with no signs of fire, almost silently. Its demise left no scars from conquering, and its walls were devoid of mass graves and broken. Monuments depict a cataclysmic catastrophe, but Corral just faded its. Why did they abandon the plazas, its pyramids, its flutes, and its drums to the wandering sands? According to some academics, the question still haunts the mega valley like a ghost. Environmental change. The concluding data points to the possibility that Corral's agriculture was severely damaged by a protracted drought. Trade networks reliant on surplus cotton would have wilted in the fields if the river's life-giving waters had not been present. Food would have upset Corral's meticulous equilibrium. Its severe climate may have ultimately caused it to topple over beyond repair. According to some interpretations, trade routes changed as nearby societies expanded and new power centers appeared along the Carol's impact around the shore and inland may have reduced the commodities they previously provided. Cotton, seafood, and produce were insufficient to maintain their position as a leading metropolis, gradually becoming the lifeblood of. Others speak of internal decay, while trade is drained away. Written sources, we can only speculate about religious turmoil, political conflicts, or just plain weariness following centuries of. Nonetheless, even harmonious civilizations can break apart when survival becomes a concern. Regardless of the reason, the departure appears to have been gradual. Unexpectedly, families probably moved away one by one in search of more fruitful areas. Children who once raced over Corral's plazas grew up narrating tales of a lost world, stronger rivers, and fresh starts. Stories from the metropolis behind them that would ultimately become legends in the desert. Restored what people had constructed, with winds carrying fine sand across temples made of stone. What had once been a bright humming was now buried behind shifting dunes with flutes. For almost 4,000 years, civilization was reduced to a field of silent sleeping mounds. Corral stayed. While archaeologists wait today, a whisper is concealed beneath the sands. With precise stone turning, the issue remains. How does a city so sophisticated and exquisitely built just disappear? In fact, it's possible that even the most enlightened and tranquil civilizations are but slender strands in the fabric of time. For millennia, Carol lay exposed to the invisible forces of change, buried beneath the quiet dunes of the Super Valley travelers forgotten, never realizing that beneath their feet were the remains of the weird spherical hills that studded the area. For a civilization that before the Egyptian pyramids, these were simply natural, wind-sculpted mounds, and it wasn't until the late 20th century that the 1990s would see the return of Carol's voice to the globe. Ruth Shady, a Peruvian archaeologist, led a group into the Soup Valley because she was curious and felt that these hills may contain mysteries that no one has yet discovered. What they discover would change the course of history. Layer by meticulous layer, the history of human civilization in the Americas. Sand was swept away, revealing walls of meticulously chiseled stone behind it. Pyramids, buried squares, staircases, and a city much older than anyone could have. The astounding corral was almost 4,600 years old, as proved by hypothetical radiocarbon dating. It was a startling finding to learn that ancient civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt were flourishing at the same time. Archaeological grounds prior to Carol academics' belief that civilization in the vast powers of the Old World eclipsed the development of the Americas. Corral transformed everything by demonstrating that the Americas had produced intricate urban life, colossal architecture, and societal structure separately long before the Incas or Mare rose to power. Ruth Shady and her group discovered more than just debris and stones. They also discovered fishing nets, musical instruments, and the remains of living things. Ancient knot records, fabrics, and even sacrifices offered to the gods each. The artifact described a people who had established a society with profound understanding and vision. More than just a scholarly achievement, Creative Carl's rediscovery was a revival. A society that had long lain dormant beneath the desert was suddenly exposed beneath the return to the open sky, its squares embraced by the same winds that formerly transported the. Today, the sounds of flutes and children's laughing are acknowledged as a delicate and invaluable link to humanity's earliest history is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Thoughts of creating a sense of identity and the conviction that the dunes have effectively concealed Corral, but ultimately, the stones persisted, hoping that someone will pay attention and remember that Carol stands as a quiet. Among its pyramids and plazas, the giant serves as a reminder that civilization's origins are much deeper than we previously thought. Our perception of humanity's journey is altered by the old stones whispering of a tale that is not one of conquering and conflict, but also of peace, creativity, and optimism long before the imposing empires of. The inhabitants of Corral were constructing something in Greece, Rome, or perhaps Egypt. Amazingly, they plotted the constellations without written records, built pyramids without a wheel, and prosperous community based on engineering, trade music, and rituals without leaving any traces of. In an era frequently characterized by violence, war on the land, Corral presents an alternative perspective on what a civilization can be: a community that prioritized relationships over knowledge acquisition. Domination serves as a reminder that greatness does not necessarily necessitate violence, is determined by how a society comes together to build rather than by how many troops march across a battlefield. Carol's legacy extends much beyond the arid shores of the Soup. It questions the long-held belief that civilization had a single cradle, that monumental architecture and urban life were originally found in the Old World. Demonstrates how the inventive and aspirational spirit of humanity emerged independently in different parts of the earth, formed by many hands, yet propelled by the same timeless aspirations to walk among corrals today and persevere in celebrating and reaching for the divine. You can practically hear the faint buzz of flutes and the pulse of drums in the worn remains. Children laughing as they race through stone lanes and traders negotiating in the plazas beneath a sky of. We still bear the inscriptions of many stars, lives, dreams, and stories. Carol reminds us that even when civilizations collapse, their spirits can continue to sleep, lying beneath the sands to be recalled and to be inspired once more in the great historical chronology. Corral stands out not only as a remnant of the past, but also as a message for the future that even in the most hostile deserts, even under the seeds of curiosity, wisdom, and peace can germinate and grow in the hardest sands. A world that strives for excellence